They really thought they were fooling you. They thought the smile looked convincing. They thought the rehearsed stories sounded believable. They thought the carefully crafted image they presented to the world was strong enough to hide what was actually happening beneath the surface. And for a while they were confident. Confident that you were buying it. Confident that you were missing the obvious. Confident that you were just another person willing to accept appearances at face value. But what they never understood is that chosen ones rarely process information the way everyone else does. You don't just listen to words. You listen to energy. You don't just observe behavior. You observe inconsistencies. You don't just hear what someone says. You notice what their spirit is struggling to hide. That is why so many manipulators become uncomfortable around you without fully understanding why. Something about your presence makes them feel exposed. Something about the way you observe quietly instead of reacting immediately makes them nervous. They sense that you are seeing more than you are saying. And usually they're right. Because while they were focused on managing appearances, your discernment was collecting information. Your intuition was noticing patterns. Your spirit was picking up signals that your conscious mind had not fully processed yet. You didn't just guess their motives. You felt them. You sensed them. You recognized them. They didn't know that your spirit was actively running a background check on their soul. You didn't just guess their motives. Heaven handed you the blueprint. That is the fool's errand of trying to deceive a chosen one. The deception might work on people who only evaluate the surface. It might work on people who ignore red flags. It might work on people who silence their intuition in order to stay comfortable. But it rarely works for long with someone whose discernment is awake. Because chosen ones are often given a form of spiritual intelligence that operates beyond logic. Long before the facts appear, long before the evidence becomes visible, and long before the truth reveals itself publicly, something inside them already knows. And that knowing is what this message is about. The interesting thing about deception is that it is much harder to maintain than most people realize. A person can control their words. They can rehearse their story. They can carefully manage the image they want others to see. But controlling the subconscious is a completely different challenge, because the truth is constantly trying to escape. That is why people who live behind masks often leak information without realizing it. A slight hesitation before answering a simple question. A forced smile that appears half a second too late. A sudden shift in tone when a particular subject comes up. A strange inconsistency between what they are saying and what their energy is communicating. Most people miss these details. You don't. And that difference has confused manipulators your entire life. Because they assume everyone processes information the way they do. They believe that if the story sounds convincing, the performance is complete. They focus on words because they assume words are enough. But your awareness operates differently. You notice timing. You notice emotional shifts. You notice when someone's confidence disappears for a brief moment. You notice when their body language contradicts their message. You notice when their energy changes before their behavior does. And often, you notice these things without consciously trying. That is why there have been situations where you could not immediately explain why you felt uncomfortable around someone. Nothing obvious had happened yet. There was no clear evidence, no dramatic event, no undeniable proof. Yet something inside you kept whispering. Pay attention. At first, you may have doubted yourself. You may have told yourself you were overthinking. You may have tried giving people the benefit of the doubt. You may have ignored the feeling because logic had not yet caught up with what your spirit already knew. But eventually the truth appeared. And when it did, you realized the warning had been there from the beginning. That pattern has repeated throughout your life more times than you can count. Because deception creates friction. The mask and the reality cannot perfectly align forever. Sooner or later, something leaks. Sooner or later, the hidden resentment appears. Sooner or later, the jealousy slips through. Sooner or later, the manipulation reveals itself. And while everyone else is focused on the performance, your discernment is quietly studying the cracks. That is why people become so shocked when you eventually see through them. From their perspective, they were careful. From your perspective, they were obvious. Not because they made one massive mistake, but because they made hundreds of tiny ones. Tiny inconsistencies. Tiny contradictions. Tiny shifts in energy. Tiny moments where the truth escaped before they could pull it back. And your mind was collecting all of it. Read that again. Your mind was collecting all of it. Even when you weren't consciously analyzing the situation. Even when you were focused on something else. Even when you were trying to give people a fair chance. Your awareness was still recording the data. That is why chosen ones often know the ending of a situation long before everyone else does. Not because they are psychic. Not because they are guessing. But because their discernment notices information most people ignore. And when enough of those small signals accumulate, the picture becomes impossible to miss. The manipulator thinks they are hiding. The chosen one sees the pattern. The liar focuses on the story. The chosen one notices the leaks. And eventually the truth becomes so obvious that even the people who doubted your instincts begin seeing exactly what you saw from the beginning. That is when the manipulator realizes something uncomfortable. The mask never fooled you as much as they thought it did. But there is another layer to this that goes beyond observation. Because sometimes you know something before there is enough visible evidence to explain why. That is the part that has confused you throughout your life. You meet someone and instantly feel uneasy, even though they have done nothing obvious. You walk into a situation and sense that something is off, even when everything appears normal on the surface. You hear someone's words and immediately feel a disconnect between what is being said and what is actually true. And later, sometimes weeks, months, or even years later, reality catches up to the feeling you had on day one. That experience is not unfamiliar to you. In fact, it has happened so many times that you can no longer dismiss it as coincidence. Because what many chosen ones call intuition is often much deeper than instinct alone. It feels like information arriving before the evidence, a knowing before the facts, a warning before the event, a truth before the revelation. That is what many people describe as the divine download. The quiet whisper that reaches your spirit before your logical mind has enough information to build a case. And this is where chosen ones often struggle. Because logic wants proof. Logic wants timelines. Logic wants evidence that can be explained and verified immediately. But discernment often arrives first. The feeling comes first. The knowing comes first. The awareness comes first. Then reality eventually provides the confirmation. That delay can be frustrating. You feel something is wrong, but you cannot yet explain it. You sense hidden motives, but you cannot yet prove them. You recognize danger, but the evidence remains invisible. And because you are a fair person, you do not want to accuse someone based on a feeling alone. So you wait. You observe. You pay attention. And over time the truth reveals itself. That is why so many chosen ones have experienced the strange feeling of watching a prediction unfold in real time. Not because they were trying to predict the future, but because their spirit already recognized a pattern that had not fully surfaced yet. Meanwhile, manipulators make a critical mistake. They assume that if they can hide evidence, they can hide truth. But truth is larger than evidence. Before behavior becomes visible, energy exists. Before actions become public, intentions exist. Before consequences appear, patterns exist. And your discernment is often detecting those patterns long before they become obvious to everyone else. That is why certain people become nervous around you. They cannot understand why you seem difficult to deceive. They cannot understand why your distance increases before their mask slips publicly. They cannot understand why you quietly withdraw before the betrayal fully reveals itself. From their perspective, it feels impossible, because they assume you discovered information. What they fail to realize is that you received insight. And insight changes everything. Because when heaven is handing you pieces of the blueprint, you stop relying exclusively on appearances. You stop assuming that what you see is all that exists. You learn to respect the quiet signals that arrive before the evidence. Not blindly, not emotionally, but carefully, patiently, wisely. That is why your discernment has protected you so many times throughout your journey. The warning often arrived before the damage. The awareness often arrived before the exposure. The truth often arrived before the proof. And while others were waiting for visible confirmation, your spirit was already being prepared for what was coming next. That is the power of the divine download. And it is one of the reasons manipulators are always shocked when you eventually know far more than they thought possible. One of the most misunderstood strengths of a chosen one is the ability to know and remain silent. Because once your discernment reveals the truth, the temptation is to immediately confront it, to expose the lie, to challenge the inconsistency, to force the mask to come off right then and there. But wisdom often chooses a different strategy. Observation. That is where many manipulators make their biggest mistake. The moment they realize you are not reacting, they assume you are unaware. The moment you stop questioning them, they assume they have convinced you. The moment you remain calm, they mistake your patience for ignorance. And that misunderstanding becomes incredibly valuable. Because when people believe they are getting away with something, they become careless. The performance gets sloppy. The mask starts slipping. The contradictions increase. And the darkness they worked so hard to hide begins revealing itself without any help from you. That is why playing the fool can become such a powerful position. Not because you are pretending to be weak. Not because you enjoy deception. But because observation reveals far more than confrontation ever could. When people feel exposed, they become defensive. When people feel safe, they become revealing. Read that again. When people feel safe, they become revealing. The manipulator who thinks they fooled you often tells on themselves. They grow more confident, more reckless, more comfortable. They assume the danger has passed. They assume their story has been accepted. They assume the chosen one never noticed the inconsistencies. Meanwhile, you are watching, listening, learning, collecting patterns. You are allowing the situation to develop naturally because truth has a way of exposing itself when given enough time. And that patience creates an enormous advantage. Because many people reveal their character not through one dramatic mistake, but through repetition. The same behaviors, the same patterns, the same energy, again and again until the picture becomes undeniable. If you confront too early, they can deny. If you react too early, they can deflect. If you expose too early, they can claim misunderstanding. But when you allow time to do its work, something interesting happens. The evidence starts building itself. The contradictions start stacking themselves. The mask starts removing itself. And eventually, even the people who once defended them begin noticing what you noticed from the beginning. That is why chosen ones often appear calm during situations that should make them angry. It is not because they are unaware. It is because they are observing. They understand that immediate reactions often provide less information than silence. They understand that some truths reveal themselves more clearly when people are left alone with their own choices. And for manipulators, that becomes dangerous. Because the longer they believe they are fooling you, the more they expose themselves. The longer they think they are winning, the more evidence they create. The longer they assume you are blind, the more visible their intentions become. Eventually a point arrives where the truth is no longer hidden. Not because you forced it, not because you chased it, but because darkness always struggles to maintain a disguise forever. And when that moment arrives, the manipulator often discovers something that completely unsettles them. You knew far earlier than they ever imagined. You simply chose to watch. Then comes the moment they never prepare for, the moment of precision. Because after weeks, months, or sometimes even years of observation, there comes a point where the truth has fully revealed itself. The pattern is complete. The contradictions are undeniable. The mask has slipped enough times that there is no longer any confusion about what is actually happening. And that is when everything changes. Not because you explode emotionally, not because you seek revenge, not because you create drama, but because you speak with precision. That is what catches them off guard. They expected anger. They expected accusations. They expected emotional chaos. Instead, they encounter clarity. Calm, controlled, undeniable clarity. You mention details they thought nobody noticed. You reference patterns they assumed were hidden. You point out contradictions they believed were buried beneath layers of performance. And you do it without raising your voice, without becoming reactive, and without needing endless explanations. Just facts. Just observations. Just truth. That is what creates the shock. Because manipulators spend so much time preparing defenses against emotion that they rarely prepare for discernment. They know how to argue. They know how to redirect conversations. They know how to twist narratives. They know how to provoke reactions they can later use against someone. But they do not know what to do when a chosen one calmly describes the blueprint. Suddenly their confidence disappears. The smile changes. The posture shifts. The certainty fades. Because in that moment they realize something deeply unsettling. You were paying attention the entire time. Read that again. You were paying attention the entire time. Every inconsistency. Every hidden motive. Every shift in behavior. Every subtle leak. Every moment they thought they were successfully controlling the narrative. You saw far more than they imagined. And the most powerful part is that you do not need physical proof for every detail. By the time the confrontation happens, the pattern itself has become the proof. The repetition has become the proof. The consistency of the behavior has become the proof. You are not speaking from emotion. You are speaking from accumulated observation. That distinction matters, because emotion can be dismissed. Discernment is harder to argue with. The manipulator can challenge one event. They can explain away one mistake. They can deny one accusation. But when an entire pattern is laid out in front of them with calm precision, their options become limited. That is when the shock becomes visible. Not because they got caught, but because they finally understand they were never as hidden as they believed. The chosen one saw the blueprint. The chosen one followed the pattern. The chosen one connected the pieces. And now the illusion has nowhere left to hide. That moment rarely requires yelling. It rarely requires revenge. It rarely requires dramatic exposure. The truth itself carries enough weight. And when delivered with certainty, composure, and emotional control, it creates an impact far greater than any argument ever could. Because for the first time, they are forced to face a reality they spent months trying to avoid. The person they thought they were deceiving understood the situation all along. The person they underestimated was quietly collecting information while they were busy maintaining appearances. The person they assumed was fooled had already seen through the performance long before the mask finally slipped. And that realization stays with them. Because once someone experiences that level of discernment, they never look at you the same way again. After that experience, something changes permanently. Not just in you, in them. Because once someone has been seen that clearly, once they have experienced what it feels like for their hidden motives to be recognized without obvious evidence, they become much more careful around you. The game loses its appeal. The manipulation loses its excitement. The deception loses its confidence. Why? Because uncertainty has shifted sides. For years, they were the ones operating with hidden information. They believed they understood people better than people understood them. They believed they could conceal motives, disguise intentions, and move through situations without being fully detected. But after experiencing your discernment, they are no longer certain of that. Now they are the ones wondering what you see. Now they are the ones questioning how much you know. Now they are the ones feeling exposed. That is the permanent shift. And what makes it so powerful is that it does not require intimidation. You do not need to threaten anyone. You do not need to announce your awareness. You do not need to constantly prove your discernment. The reputation forms naturally. People remember. They remember the accuracy. They remember the calmness. They remember how certain truths emerged exactly the way you sensed they would. And once that happens, many stop trying the same games altogether. Not because they suddenly became honest, but because they recognize the risk. They realize they are dealing with someone who pays attention, someone who notices patterns, someone who trusts their discernment enough to wait for confirmation instead of rushing into confusion. That realization creates distance. The manipulators become more cautious. The deceivers become less comfortable. The people hiding behind masks become aware that their performance may not be as convincing as they imagine. And for you, this creates a different kind of freedom. You stop feeling the need to constantly prove what you know. You stop chasing validation. You stop arguing with people who are determined to hide behind appearances. Instead, you trust your discernment, observe patiently, and allow time to reveal what needs revealing. Because experience has taught you something invaluable. When heaven shows you the blueprint, reality eventually catches up to it. And once you truly understand that, you stop doubting yourself every time your spirit notices something your eyes cannot yet prove. So before you leave this message, remember this. Stop dismissing what your spirit keeps trying to tell you. Some of the greatest protections in your life came from listening to quiet warnings before the evidence appeared. Some of the most important decisions you ever made started as a feeling you could not fully explain. Some of the biggest truths you uncovered arrived long before anyone else could see them. That is not something to fear. That is something to respect. Because throughout your journey, your discernment has repeatedly proven itself. It has protected you from hidden agendas, exposed manipulation, revealed character, and guided you through situations that logic alone could not fully navigate. Trust that gift. Not blindly, not emotionally, but wisely, patiently, with confidence. The more you learn to honor your discernment, the less vulnerable you become to deception. The more you trust the blueprint heaven places in your spirit, the easier it becomes to recognize truth beneath appearances. And never forget this. You did not survive everything you survived by accident. You were guided, you were protected, and you were shown things for a reason. If this message spoke directly to your spirit today, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs this reminder. And in the comments type, "I trust my discernment." Let that declaration be a reminder that your intuition is not your enemy. It may be one of the greatest gifts heaven ever gave you.